how likely is it for you to become a professional footballer? In this video, we'll be going through the truth about actually going pro in football. So it's no secret that it is extremely difficult to become a professional football player, but no one really talks about the numbers. If you look at the numbers, it actually seems incredibly, almost basically impossible to become a professional football player. And these are the numbers I'm talking about. Right now, there are 250 million players registered across the globe. This is the entire world. There's 250 million roughly players that are actually registered playing football. Of those players registered, 123,000 of them are professional players. And now this is the world, right? So it's all leagues, not just the top 5. That is 0.05%. So of everyone playing football in the world right now, 0.05 will make it into a professional league, which is nothing. Now, out of those, 0.001 are playing in a top 5 league in Europe. What most of you would probably consider the dream, right? Now, going even further, out of all the players in the world registered, 0.00036% of you guys will compete in the Champions League. So if you're hearing this for the first time, it can be a bit daunting. It probably feels like it is impossible to become a professional player. It probably feels like everything is stacked against you, and it's probably not even worth you trying to even go for it, right? And if I'm being honest, if you feel that way, you probably shouldn't, because it's the players that have heard me say that and have gone, yeah, but there's still a chance, right? If XYZ player, if Anthony can play in Manchester United, then I can too, right? And unfortunately, that is the mentality that you have to have in the football world and in life in general for most things. If you're wanting to be great, if you're wanting to get to that sort of upper echelon of anything. And I guess I wanted to talk about those sort of stats because I haven't really said them in a video before. And I do get a lot of parents and players that talk to me about how difficult it really is to go pro, and they're right. And it was actually the other day when I was speaking to a parent in one of the rare free consults that I'll still do, and they asked about my success rate with elite football. And I told them my success rate, and currently, and haven't really said this online before, but the success rate that we have is between 8 and 10%. So for any player that comes on board with my player obsession program, we have an 8 to 10% chance statistically with the last 100 players we've worked with that they're going to get either a scholarship or a professional contract with a club. Now, I'm extremely happy with that percentage. I think 8 to 10% is extremely high for the work we do, and I guess the fact that it's the football industry, right? And when I was speaking to this parent and I told them the 8 to 10 percentage, they actually thought it was low, and they sort of felt that it was, so only 10% of all the players you work with, so 9 out of every player you work with doesn't get anything, right? And I guess at the end of the day, it is all about perspective, because like they were just hearing that perspective of 10%, right? Whereas I know that when I'm comparing what my agency does, I'm comparing it with the rest of the world and all other agencies. And the fact that less than 1% of players actually make it with all agency regardless, and the fact that we can work with amateur players and our success rate is at 8 to 10%, I'm very happy about the work we do. And so do I think it's perfect? No, of course not. Would I love to improve the percentage of players we get signed? Of course. I'd love it to be 50%. I'd love it to be higher. And do I think it's possible right now? Probably not. But that being said, when I first started working as an agent and building this agency, our success rate was much lower. And if you were to tell me 5 years ago that I was going to have a success rate of 8 to 10%, I wouldn't have believed that it was possible. But here we are. And so the fact that today we have this, in the next 3, 4, 5 years, it's probably going to be better. It has to be better, right? And that being said, when I see these statistics and I talk to people about it, and I know that I always make videos about, how you need connections, you need to focus on the business game of football, you need to think about what you can do to actually get exposure, yada yada, and all these things. I think people also forget that, like I say in other videos, it's not just about talent, right? And it's not just about being a player, because out of those 250 million players that are playing around, you could probably cut off more than half of that percentage, and say that they're in underdeveloped continents, right? Like your South America, your Africa, your, some parts of Asia, etc., etc. And unfortunately, even looking at it from like a financial standpoint, just because they are where they are, they're not going to get the correct exposure, right, from these big European clubs. And so just by default, it just increases the percentage of what is likely you watching this video. And as we keep going along and checking off all these different things, your percentage is actually a lot higher than that 0.05% that I mentioned earlier because of where you currently live. Then as we move forward, if you start working with an agency, if you start doing all these things like I always talk about, my agency, out of every 10 players that works with me, one of them signs a scholarship or a contract, right? That can pay for the player rep. So even that, like if out of every 10 players we work with, you know, one of them signs something, that's a 10%, right, success rate. Even just by simply working with my agency, you've given yourself 200 times more likelihood of actually making it as a footballer, right? Comparing it to the 0.05% that we were talking about before. And so I think there's things like that that people can't see, that perspective shift, right? Where you do something like that, there's other things that you probably then add to it, add to your experience, add to your performance, add to your nutrition, connections, yada yada, whatever, different areas that you get placed in overseas. Even with me, as we go further in the statistics of my agency, there's a correlation between how many trips players go on and the success rate that we have in the agency. So when a player goes to one club, you know, their first trip, it's an X percentage, but as they do their second or third trips, it actually increases because we found that it's the players that are trying out at multiple different clubs that end up getting signed, not just the ones that get lucky and get signed at the very first club. That's a very, very, very small percentage for us. Whereas if we can expose a player to more clubs and more exposure, the likelihood gets higher, the percentage increases. And so there's all common sense stuff that I think people don't take into consideration because you're too focused on thinking about the talent, thinking about how good you need to be, thinking that you need to perform in Australia to be able to perform overseas. All these sort of things add up to it. But I just want to talk about this in this video. I want to be raw and go, yeah, if you look at the statistics face value, football's extremely difficult. But then when I compare the statistics that I've got, all of a sudden things change. And, you know, 10% is still pretty achievable, right? And the more you go, the more trips, the more exposure you go into, it gets higher. Now, is everyone watching this video going to become a professional? Of course not. It's not going to happen. But I do think it's a lot easier than people think it is. And obviously for me as well, hopefully I'll be watching this video back in a few years and go, actually, for amateurs, it's now 25%, it's now 30%, whatever. Because my job is to cater and to stack the odds in my favor and my agency favor with the contracts that we sign, with the club negotiations, with everything that we do. And so that's what I want to talk about. Did those statistics make you feel worse about wanting to become a footballer, or did it make you feel like you want to do it even more now? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed me yapping, consider subscribing. If you haven't already, you can always choose to unsubscribe.